Okay, we're going to talk about negative numbers. Just a quick history note. Negative numbers first appeared in a book called 9 Chapters on the Mathematical Art, which dates from the Han Dynasty in China. So that's somewhere between 202 BC to 220 AD. So negative numbers have been around for a while, but they weren't really used widely until about 500 years ago. Okay. Now, what are negative numbers? Negative numbers are numbers that are less than 0. Okay, so if you add a negative number, what you end up doing is basically subtracting. Okay, from a mathematician's point of view, subtraction is really just adding negative numbers. All right, so let's take a look at how operations with negative numbers works. So if I have, say, something like 5 plus a negative number, let's say negative 4, then what that boils down to is really just subtraction, right? When I'm adding a negative, it's the same as just subtracting. So I end up with 1, right? Okay, what if I'm adding a negative to a negative? So if I have negative 3 and I'm going to add, I don't know, negative 4, what happens there? Well, what this is saying is I'm starting off 3 below 0, and I need to keep going away from 0 4 more steps. So this ends up being more negative. So you get negative 7. Okay? Similarly, this is also negative 3 minus positive 4 is a way to think of it. And both of those would give you negative 7. Okay, cool. Obviously, if I have a positive plus a positive, it'll be a positive. So negative plus negative is negative, positive plus positive is positive. And if you add a positive and a negative, then the result you get could be positive, could be negative, depends which one's bigger. Okay, let's take a look at that. If I have a number like, say, 6 plus negative 10, okay? Then what we get, if I were to interpret this as a subtraction, is 6 minus 10. Okay, now the way that we've been doing subtraction would say, oh, you can't do this, because if I take 6 and minus 10, there's just no way of doing this calculation the way that it's done there. But what we can do is spin that calculation around and say, hey, look at 10 minus 6, but then we're going to put a negative of that. So 10 minus 6 is 4, and so my answer is negative 4. That's how that works. So when you want to find 6 minus 10, you can just do 10 minus 6 and put a negative in front of it. All right, so that's how negative numbers work. Obviously, if I'm going to subtract a negative number, so if I have 5 minus, we'll keep going with negative 4, 5 minus negative 4, a minus minus makes a plus, right? This is taking away a debt, which is the same as just giving someone money. So 5 minus minus ends up being plus. So 5 plus 4 is 9. Okay, so adding and subtracting with negative numbers, pretty easy. Just you have to remember, when you're adding a negative, it turns into subtraction. When you're subtracting a negative, it turns into addition. If you add 2 negative numbers together, then we get the negative of the 3 and the 4 added together. Okay, sounds good. Now, what about multiplication and division of negative numbers? Okay, well, that's actually, believe it or not, easier. Okay, not necessarily so much easier to wrap your head around it, but once you have, it becomes very simple. If I'm going to multiply by a negative number, so let's say I'm doing 5 times negative 4, my answer is always going to be, you take the 2 numbers here and multiply them together, the two magnitudes, so 5 and 4, and that ends up being 20. And then you see, okay, you take the sign of your first number, and since I'm multiplying by a negative, I change the sign of the first number. So this becomes a negative. So if I'm multiplying by a negative, it changes the sign. So let's do another example. If I have negative 5, I'm going to put that in brackets to make it clear what's going on. Negative 5 times negative 3. Now what I have is a negative times a negative, so multiplying by this negative is going to change the sign here, so it'll be a positive. And I'll have 5 times 3 is 15. Okay, so that ends up being positive 15. All right, and last situation, if I have a negative number, so let's say negative 7 times a positive times positive 2, right? Then in that situation, when you're multiplying by a positive, that doesn't switch the sign. So it's going to stay negative, and it'll be negative 14, because 7 times 2 is 14. So that's how that works. There's actually a poem that is sometimes used, minus times minus is plus, the reason we need not discuss. Okay, so if you're happy with that, excellent. If you need some more reasons for why a negative times a negative is a positive, you can talk to me in class about it. Okay, cool. Now, what about with division? Well, the thing with division, as we learned when we were working with fractions, is that division is just the same thing as multiplication, but we're multiplying by the reciprocal. Okay, so let's just do that real quick. Let's say I have 10 divided by negative 2, right? Well, okay, what we're going to do is we're asking the question, okay, what's 10 divided by 2? And then we're asking, is it going to be positive or negative, right? Well, 10 divided by 2 is definitely 5, all right? If we're dividing by a negative, all right, that will switch the sign, just like with multiplication. So the sign was positive, and now it becomes negative, right? And remember, the reason that's the case is because this is actually just the same thing as 10 times the reciprocal of negative 2, which is negative 1/2, which is obviously, now it's a positive times a negative, and we know how that works. Okay, cool. So when we're dividing by a negative, it switches the sign. If I have a negative times a negative, negative divided by a negative, so let's say negative 20 divided by, let's say, negative 5. Let's put brackets around this to make it clear what's going on. Okay, so if I have a negative divided by a negative, now I'm going to end up with a positive, because when I divide by a negative, it switches the sign of the original number. So the positive that I get is going to be 20 divided by 5, which is 4. So this ends up being a positive 4. Okay? And of course, if I have a negative, let's go with 32. If I go with negative 32 and I divide by a positive, let's say 8. I don't know why I'm putting it in brackets, but it's a positive 8. Okay, then in that case, we're still going to have a negative, and we have 32 divided by 8 is 4. So this ends up being negative 4, right? So there you have it. Multiplying by negatives changes the sign. Dividing by negatives changes the sign. All right, if you start with a negative and you divide by a positive, nothing happens, because nothing changes to the negative, I should say. The numbers change, obviously. Right, if you divide by a negative, if you started with a negative, it becomes a positive. If you started with a positive, it becomes a negative. Okay, sounds good. Thus, we are done discussing negative numbers and how they work. So we can check that. Okay, so we're checking off negative numbers. On to order of operations. Here we go.